the effective interest rates.
Yes.
Yeah, but guys, let's just continue the conversation and talk a little bit about this World Economic Forum gathering that took place in Davos. I know you guys wanted to talk about it this week.
Can I just applaud J. Cal's intellectual honesty? I'm like blown away right now.
Well, it's because he's sick. Okay, so look.
No, it's because I'm not moderating. When I moderate, I'm always trying to get the best out of you, Sacks.
The budget conversation is an important one as it relates also to the global economy and growth. So Davos took place, over this past week, just so everyone knows. And I remember, working at Google 2004. I remember like how exciting it was for the executives to kind of start to transition into the Davos stage. It became this moment where you're kind of finally on the world stage. It's an exciting moment for CEOs, for world leaders, for global economists to get together, talk about the state of the global economy, where the world is headed, what we can and should be doing about it. And Davos is also this place of pride and prestige for being invited and being a part of the party, the global elite party, as some people are now calling it. And that's what I think is the important conversation, is that the World Economic Forum gathering in Davos has recently been cast as this gathering of the global elites, those who are trying to take control and run the world as they see fit. And Sacks, I'd love your point of view on how that transition has happened. Because one of the important ways that the Davos gathering has been cast and the World Economic Forum has been cast is in the negative light of being globalists. And globalism has had a really important role in driving global economic growth and prosperity. And it has had these adverse effects in the US, as we've seen with wealth inequality, loss of jobs, offshoring, gutting of industries, and so on. I think that there's a really important way that Davos has been politicized, but the risk of that is significant. Because if we do lean into this globalist notion and say it's all about elites trying to take control of our world, and we all become isolationists, that countries around the world can suffer deeply from the economic consequences of that shift. So maybe, Sacks, you can kick this off, and especially in light of our conversation today about the need for economic growth and the reduction of global debt to support, a more prosperous world in the future. This idea that right now we're talking about Davos and the World Economic Forum as a gathering of global elites. And maybe, Sacks, you can kind of give us the history and the point of view on how that positioning has come about.
Well, it's a meeting of global business and government leaders. So they are the elites. I mean, you add them all together and they do control a substantial portion of the world economy and most of the nations with the biggest economies. So there's no question these are some of the most important people in the world. A bunch of the articles coming out of Davos reported the somber mood and tone of the conference, and the level of anxiety and worry was very high. And I think that for a brief moment, it looked like these people were staring in the mirror and realizing that their management of the global economy over the last couple of decades has been a bit of a disaster. I mean, you do have ruinous deficits and debts piling up in both the U.S. and across the world, something like 350% debt to GDP globally. So we've talked about that. You've got this war in Ukraine that I and many people around the world think was easily avoidable and was a diplomatic failure. You're coming off of 2 years of badly botched COVID mismanagement, where the governments of the world pursued a horrible policy on COVID and made everything worse. You've got decades of energy policy promoted by the World Economic Forum, where they want to get people off fossil fuels and natural gas and get them onto less dense, less reliable energy, including promoting things like organic farming in Sri Lanka, which we talked about on the show, caused their economy to collapse. You've got the World Economic Forum promoting ideas like you're going to own nothing in the year 2030 and you're going to be eating insects because no one should be eating meat. So you've got these like wacky, extreme, environmentalist ideas and anti-capitalist, anti-property ideas coming out of Davos. So I think the whole thing's been a bit of a disaster. And for a brief moment, it looked like these people, again, were self-reflecting on their role in creating these disasters. But of course, the tone quickly shifted to blaming disinformation on social media as the root cause of all these problems, as opposed to their decades of decision-making running the leading nations of the world and the leading companies of the world. And I think that the blame is properly put not on social media, but on these leaders for making, bad decisions.
Do you believe in the benefits of global trade, where countries trade with one another and shift the sourcing of supply and labor to the cheaper source so that the buyer can benefit from having things at a lower price and ultimately the global economy grows as kind of being beneficial to the US over the last 30 years or net negative? Because we talked, about the obvious consequences of global trade where we've had industries gutted in the United States and now we're trying to onshore them again and build redundancy and so on. But that's becoming very expensive and ultimately leads to the inflation of goods and services. And so as you look at kind of the positive agenda of the World Economic Forum over the last 30 years being about improving global trade and global relations to enable global trade, are you an anti-globalist? And do you start to see yourself falling more in that camp as you see and hear more of what comes out of Davos and from these organizations like them?
Well, look, all economic prosperity comes from trade. If we didn't have trade, then we would all be subsistence farmers and hunters and gatherers. So we basically specialize in something and then create an overabundance of that and trade it for the rest of our necessities. The issue is that trade not only creates prosperity, it creates dependencies because you're dependent on the people you're trading with. And also it has distributional effects in terms of geopolitical consequences. So trade with China has created some prosperity, but it's also hollowed out the American manufacturing sector while also making China very rich, which has basically turned China into a major geopolitical competitor for the United States. So I'm not like a free trade fanatic. I mean, I understand the ways that trade creates wealth, but I think it can also create these downsides that have to be managed. And the fact of the matter is that this unfettered free trade ideology contained the seeds of its own destruction because all the revisionist powers who are seeking to revise the U.S.-led global order, they were basically enriched and built up by the very free trade ideology that neoliberals were promoting. So this neoliberal world order has kind of created the seeds of its own destruction. I think that it would have been much smarter for us 2 decades ago to be much more restrained in the China trade and to not throw open our markets to Chinese products. We basically gave them MFN status. This is back in the early 2000s, and it was a bipartisan project and a bipartisan decision. But the result of that has been the rapid rise of China at the expense of our manufacturing sectors.
And to the benefit of our consumer class, right? I mean, we do have $600 iPhones because of it, and we do have cheap TVs, and there has been a consumer market that's demanded these low-priced goods to live a better life, right? So everyone gets cheap goods at Target, but in exchange for that, we now have a real peer competitor to the United States, which is capable of disrupting, let's say, our primacy in East Asia and, is creating a much more challenging world. So look, I can understand the reasons why people bought into this 2 decades ago, but I think that if we had it to do all over again, I think most people would recognize that we should not have given China permanent MFN status, and we should have been more temperate in our willingness to throw open our markets to these countries. Chamath, do you think that the World Economic Forum has kind of transitioned into this kind of neoliberal organization now that's promoting these neoliberal beliefs that aren't really tied to the original construct of global enabling and supporting global trade and supporting the global economy and creating more prosperity and security around the world?
I think it appeals to the insecure overachiever elite.
Yeah.
Nobody building anything really gives a shit about Davos. Nobody is thinking what's going on. Nobody even knows when it happens.
Right.
So who cares about it? People who like status and went to fancy schools and wants to feel like they're in the club, and that's how they've made it, is going to this place, which underneath is a membership organization where people pay based on the number of people that get to go. So is it really that important? Substantively, no. But overachieving surplus elites in the West really value the signal that it represents to other overachieving surplus elites in the West. So that's what Davos is. That's what the Allen and Company conference has become. A lot of these things started off much purer than what they are today, but these are all membership-driven, revenue-generating efforts. In 30 or 40 years, the All-In Summit will probably become that too. It's just the nature of things. So I wouldn't spend so much time focused on a group of people getting together. The funniest thing about Davos that I saw was Zero Hedge, which said that the amount of prostitution is at record levels in Davos. And so It just kind of boils down to what it is, which is like any other conference. It just happens to be with more security guards than less security guards. And the same stupid stuff happens at Davos that happens in Vegas at Name Your Conference, CES. It's just a different kind of attendee. So I think the bigger thing is that we are learning that the world tends to have these policy perspectives that swing in a pendulum. And the problem with the pendulum is that it is at extremes. And Sacks is right. We went from an extreme where we were very closed off and we were essentially subsistence farmers. All of us were. And then the pendulum has essentially peaked probably in the mid-teens of this decade or of this century, where we realized too much globalization actually hollows out local economies. So we need to find the equilibrium point. And that inherently has more inflation, that inherently has higher prices, and that inherently has slower progress, but more consistent progress that benefits more people. And this is what is so ideologically disruptive to, again, surplus elites, because they need the $600 iPhone. The idea that they can't upgrade every year drives them into such a tizzy that they need to export all the jobs. Whereas a $1,000 iPhone or a $1,500 iPhone may just mean that your upgrade cycle is 2 years. And just ask yourself, how many times have you upgraded as soon as the phone came out to realize, man, this phone is actually worse than the previous version? And I probably could have just waited. And there's a lot of work that actually goes into building these things to actually make them better. So all you're doing is you're giving up optionality. You're allowing your brothers and sisters to struggle to basically feed the profit motives of one company. That, in hindsight, doesn't need to happen. So there's an equilibrium. And I think that these next few decades will be about finding it. We have decided, it's categorical, that that level of globalization that we have had, this unitary, singular, monocultural way of thinking about things, is over. And David's right. It's because that system has created too many threats to the hegemony that brought us there.
JCal, do you?
That's a good thing, I think, in general.
Yeah.
It'll be more prosperity for more people, but it'll be slower, and it will create points of friction that are represented in inflation and higher prices.
Right. That's right. So as JCal, as you know, Chamath points out, like if you're upgrading every 2 years instead of 1 year, your economy doesn't grow as fast. You have less spending.
Yeah.
If the price of things go up, you have inflation. The net cost of deglobalization is higher prices and lower economic growth. That's just fundamental kind of macroeconomics.
No, that's not true. That's not true, because the deglobalization in an individual economy will actually create GDP, because you'll have to rebuild the things that you used to import.
That's right. Yeah. And over a period of time, theoretically, you could catch up and accelerate. But JCal, like when you weigh this conversation about Davos and globalization and U.S. security against the one we just had, which is why I wanted to talk about this, we're running into a debt crisis. We have limited spending capacity. We have a significant amount of investment needed if we are going to cut global trade ties that we've depended on historically and start to build redundancy. Can we afford this as a country? Can the West afford this, given the economic slowdowns and inflation right now? And, you know, how do we balance kind of these conversations against our domestic challenges economically?
I think Davos has a pretty serious PR problem. They have dubbed themselves like essentially a self-appointed Illuminati for the rest of us, and that they're going to set some global agenda. I think this year's agenda was like finding the future or defining the future. Nobody asked these people to be in charge. And if you look at what's happened in the world, the chaos of COVID, and you look at what's happened in terms of energy policy in Europe, and then this obsession with social issues and being told, you know, these farmers, these truckers, you're bad people, you're not woke, whatever it is. I think the public looks at Davos as the manifestation of these global elites who are lording over them some master plan, whether it's real or not, that they're not part of, and that doesn't take them into consideration, and that takes into consideration only their profits. And when you actually peel it back, as Chamath correctly pointed out, Davos is a huge grift. They recruited me to be part of their world leaders 15 years ago after I had sold my second company. And I met Claus, the guy who runs it, at some New York Four Seasons event. And then I got the bill. And to be a world leader was $40,000. And I was like, what, a global future leader? I don't know what that means, but I'm not giving you $40,000.
Sorry,
And then
you had to pay?
you had to pay to be a global future leader. And you didn't have to pay for a $6,000 TED ticket at the time. This was joke. 40 large. And I just thought, this is not for me. And
what a joke.
I think people would much rather see some resiliency in the supply chain. And they would rather see the origins of COVID and why we spent 2 years in a lockdown. And was that a cover-up of the United States funding gain of research, being done in Wuhan? And why are we shutting down nuclear power plants? And what exactly is the energy policy in Germany? People are looking at incompetent elites going to Davos, having a big party, and then setting an agenda for them that they don't understand or want. And I think this is where, the contempt for Davos is peaking this year. And it should. If you're being invited to Davos and other people are not being invited and they don't have a seat at the table and a voice at the table, you can tell that all the journalists there are on an access journalism pass. What does that mean, access journalism? They get to come there and they get to hang out with elites if and only if their coverage fits a certain profile. And if you find me the top 10 most critical anti-globalization journalists in the world, I can guarantee you that they don't have credentials. I think it's like a bankrupt organization that should just be shut down, and the people who are going there are involved. No, I think it's culturally bankrupt.
You guys have so much disdain. It's interesting.
No, I do. I think it's like not what the world wants right now. The world wants transparency, and the world wants ownership of all the screw-ups. From COVID to energy policy, we want ownership of those issues, not a bunch of elites drinking champagne.
I'd rather spend a week with entrepreneurs, or frankly, spend a week with my kids, or spend a week playing poker with my friends.
Of course, let's do it.
There are like umpteen things that are above the list. So it's kind of like, let them get together. I think it's fine for them to get together. They should do it. I just think that if you're not there, I would not weigh these things so heavily, because it speaks more to your own insecurity than it does to their actual influence on things.
Yeah, the term elite is an interesting one. Companies need a CEO to run the company. It's not run by 10,000 employees. And governments need a president to oversee the government. And I think the idea that some small number of people that are in charge getting together is now being cast as an elite gathering, and elitism in itself is the failure, I don't think
it's an elite gathering. I think it's very important to get this nuance right. It's a gathering of elites. And that's very different than an elite gathering. An elite gathering is when like Michael Jordan and LeBron James and Steph Curry get together and work on their basketball game. That's an elite gathering. A gathering of elites is what's happening in Davos.
That's a fair point.
But they are the presidents of their companies and the presidents of their countries.
So I would differentiate between the people who are merely attending, who are paying the $40,000, who are probably a bunch of hangers-on.
It's now $250, by the way.
$250,000.
$250,000. Yeah, anyone willing to pay that is like, totally an insecure, surplus elite.
By the way, I just got back from Davos.
Oh, you did? Okay, well, congratulations. Looks good on you, though.
Yeah, right. Go ahead.
Looks good on you.
Did you spend your own money or your LP's money?
No, I didn't go to Davos.
Oh, my Lord.
If I meet one person that went to Davos that spent their own money, it's like probably none.
Right, exactly. So then there's the hangers-on who are spending $250,000 to feel important, but then there's the people who are invited who probably don't spend any money, who are basically speaking, right? And you got to say that the group of people who are speaking at Davos individually and collectively are quite influential. They are the leaders of countries and Fortune 500 companies.
Sure, but you can agree that they literally don't say anything that's noteworthy because they're not allowed to.
They're not saying anything that's that different of what they would say the previous week or the following week. So, but it's
a forum. It's a platform for
it's a forum for all these people to get together. Look, in terms of the critique of it, Friedberg, you asked how far back does this go? This is not like a new thing. The term Davos man was coined back in 2004 by a Harvard professor named Sam Huntington, who wrote a book called Clash of Civilizations. He's the professor of international relations at Harvard. And he coined the term Davos man to refer to a globalist who, quote, had little need for national loyalty, who viewed national boundaries as obstacles that are thankfully vanishing. That's how Huntington defined Davos man. And there's been a reaction to these Davos men that's been growing for a couple of decades. I mean, obviously the election of Trump was a reaction to that. Brexit was a huge reaction to that. And I think that the resistance to the imposition of their globalist policies, which I guess you could define as believing in this like borderless world, economically and politically, I think that's been receding in favor of more nationalist leaders who want to promote their own country's interests. And I think that trend's going to continue.